So Daniel Kolenda has responded or reacted to Ravi Zacharias' whole issue. It's 50 minutes long and it's an audio podcast, but I believe it's really impactful. So I've crammed it up into a summary of about less than 20 minutes or so. So just check it out. Please have time, check it out, soak it up, and learn a lot from it. So without much talking, let's just get it.
It's very clear that people have been deeply hurt by this. People that knew Ravi for decades are saying, this is not the person that we thought we knew. And of course, Ravi's gone now, but they are still having to clean up a mess. And whereas the name of Ravi Zacharias might have gone down in history as one of the great apologists that ever lived, it's possible that now the name will only be a liability. And that's not to say that all of the good things Ravi and his organization did are now discredited, but it will almost certainly detract in some way from Ravi's life work. And I'm sure that it's going to create significant problems for the people that are trying to carry on after his death. And so, again, it behooves us to take this opportunity to carefully consider the consequences of sin and compromise. And I want to admonish you and myself, let's guard our hearts and let's commit ourselves to lives of integrity as never before. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you 4 reasons that, in my estimation, leaders fall. And then I want to give you 4 ways to guard yourself and live a life worthy of the call. Okay, here we go. Reason number 1, they become complacent. You know, I started preaching when I was 14 years old, and I've been involved with some kind of ministry and some kind of leadership ever since. And I can't say that I did everything right, far from it, but one thing that I can say is that I took the responsibility of leading people, even in the smallest ways, very seriously. I still do, by the way, but I'm trying to illustrate something for the sake of this discussion. Even as a teenager, I remember being conscious of the ways that my influence was affecting my peers in school, in youth group, and so on. And there were a lot of things that I wanted to do as a teenager that I didn't do simply because I didn't want to mislead other people or be a bad influence on them. And then later, when I was entrusted with official positions of leadership, of course, that feeling of responsibility went to a whole new level, not only to be a good example for others, but to do everything with excellence, to study, to pray, to be prepared for every situation. And I didn't have very much skill or experience, but what I lacked in ability, I made up for in hard work and passion. It was a deep concern that I had to rightly represent what I was responsible for as a preacher of the gospel. The problem is this, that if you're not careful, you can let what was sacred and consecrated and guarded become common and routine and taken for granted. And in order to keep that from happening, you have to continually remind yourself that this is sacred, that it's special, that God could have chosen anybody else to do this work, but he chose me. And if you're one of those that's still at the beginning of your journey, don't forget the way you feel right now. Don't forget that humility and simplicity and purity that's motivating you. And if you ever lose that, fall on your face and cry out to God and say, Lord, don't let my heart go cold. Bring me back to my first love. Paul said in Ephesians 4:1, I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. And that's what I'm trying to urge you to today as well. And let me say this, one of the symptoms of complacency is boredom. Often leaders, especially those that tend to be very high octane, high energy, A-type personalities, if they allow themselves to slip into a complacent mode, they're in serious danger because they will quickly get bored and they'll quickly start gravitating to other things to keep them stimulated. And this is a much bigger deal than you might think. I could say a lot about this, but for those of you that are wired this way, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've got to stay in the battle or you're going to start looking for other conquests, which is exactly, in my opinion, what happened to King David. Remember, he was supposed to be out fighting in battle, and instead he was chilling at home, hanging out, and that's how he ended up getting into trouble with Bathsheba. Number two, they burn out. Now, I don't know if you've ever felt really exhausted. I'm not talking about feeling tired. Tired is how you feel after a good day of hard work. It's good for you. It helps you sleep at night. I'm talking about the feeling when you've been grinding for weeks on end with very little rest. Sometimes after a crusade in the past, I've had weeks where I preached 15 or 16 times in a 5 or 6 day period, spending as much time on airplanes as I'm spending on the ground, never having a moment to myself, always being with other people who are taking you from meeting to meeting and venue to venue. There are times after landing back in Orlando where I live and getting in the car, driving from the airport to home, I just feel like I'm collapsing on the inside. And when that happens, you'll have very little fight left in you. It's probably similar to being drunk or something because inhibition is very low and you're very vulnerable to temptation in many ways. If you're on a diet, forget it. You'll be pulling into the McDonald's drive-thru because, for me, carbs and sugar is my weakness. But if you have other proclivities, your ability to resist will be very low. And I'm not saying that you can't resist temptation in that state. You can and you must. But I'm also being real with you. If you run yourself into the ground like that, you are going to have problems of one kind or another in time. Number three, they lose their enjoyment of God and ministry. And when you've lost your enjoyment of God, that is a very important sign. It means that something critical is happening in your spiritual life. And you need to pay attention to it. It's like the warning light on the dashboard of your car. It's screaming out to you that something bad is happening. And if you neglect it, you're going to pay dearly down the road. When you lack that enjoyment, you're going to start looking for other sources of joy outside of God. Leonard Ravenhill used to say, entertainment is the devil's substitute for joy. And this is when people start turning to alcohol and drugs and porn, and they start flirting with lust and adultery and all kinds of sin. And here's the problem. These steps that I'm describing to you have this kind of snowball effect. They catalyze one another. When you start losing your enjoyment of God and you stop spending time with him and you start sinning to fill the void, then you feel guilty about the sin and you start avoiding prayer. And because of that, then you feel even further from God. So you start sinning more, which makes you feel even less like praying and so on. And so it just is this negative feedback loop. Number four, they lose their fear of God. Now, I won't say too much about this one, but when a person hardens their heart over and over again through the process that I'm describing, that hardening begins to manifest in that they lose their fear of God. And this means that sin stops bothering them. Prayerlessness stops bothering them. They have learned to resist the conviction of the Holy Spirit so much that they don't even notice it anymore. And this is where things get really, really dangerous. And to be honest, we're talking about how great leaders fall, but honestly, I think that in many cases, their fall comes not only as an inevitable consequence of the path they're on, but also as a sort of divine, merciful intervention. Because, some people need to hit rock bottom before they are going to look up. And maybe God allows some of these guys to fall just so that they're able to realize how far they've already fallen. I think something like that happened to David when he had that famous moral failure that I mentioned earlier. And I think the same thing happens today as well. We even see in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul instructs the Corinthians regarding a man that's sleeping with his mother-in-law. He says, hand him over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh so that his spirit might be saved. In other words, Paul apparently feels that this guy is so far gone that it's going to have to take some rock bottom experience to bring him back to repentance. Or maybe you haven't gone down this road at all yet and you're doing good. But still, if you're wise, you'll take heed lest you fall too, because you are also a human made of flesh and blood. And life has a way of throwing curveballs. And if you're not prepared to do what's necessary to guard yourself, then at some point in your life, you'll make an easy target for the enemy. So just like I gave you 4 reasons that leaders fall, let me give you 4 ways to protect yourself. This is not just some random list to fill space and take time. Each one of these things are things that I've lived and continue to need to remember on a daily basis. Number 1, kill your pet dragon. In my book on spiritual warfare called Slaying Dragons, I have a chapter called How to Kill Your Pet Dragon. And the title of this chapter is a bit of a playful nod to an animated children's movie called How to Train Your Pet Dragon. And it occurred to me one day that the dragons we find ourselves battling in life are often the monsters we ourselves have incubated and nurtured and even trained until they threaten to, and in some cases actually do, destroy people's lives. It starts out as something small and innocent, even cute, and they think it's no big deal. It's something that they think they can control until they can't. And by the time they come to terms with the fact that they have a problem, it's already grown into a serious monster that has the potential to destroy their family and their life and their legacy and everything they've spent their whole lives cultivating. If you think you are beyond such temptation, remember that greater men and women than you and I have been destroyed by sin. 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, "Wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." Those who think too highly of themselves and their immunity to temptation are setting themselves up for failure. This is why Paul said, "Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you." Romans 12:3, end quote. Number 2, mind in the beginning what matters in the end. Now, the last chapter of my book, Live Before You Die, contains some of the things that I'm going to mention now. For example, I told a story there that Reinhard Bonnke told me. He said that as a young man, he was kneeling at the altar during a prayer meeting next to an elderly pastor, and he overheard that old man weeping as he was praying, and he was asking God to forgive him for unclean things that he had allowed into his life. And Reinhard said that as he overheard this, it shook him. He got up and he went to the other side of the room to another spot where no one could hear, and he cried out to God with a prayer of his own, and he said, "Lord, help me to mind in the beginning what matters in the end." And I can truly say that Reinhard lived that way. He lived with the end in mind. And I believe that one of the reasons that he was able to go through his entire life in ministry without a single scandal is because of that perspective. And you know, I started out by mentioning that there are some things that can never be recovered. Among them is a good name. But Reinhard Bonnke's name not only remained a good name through his life, it's such a good name that it continues to lend credibility and favor to the ministry that he founded. Now, this is not all about names and reputations, and to the people that are connected with him, like me. That's not the main point. Staying true and being faithful is not about just earning some positive eulogies at your funeral. Fundamentally, it's about walking in a manner worthy of the calling, as I mentioned earlier. It's about living with the judgment seat of Christ in mind. And it's about knowing that one day we're going to stand before God and we're going to give an account for the things that we did in our bodies, according to 2 Corinthians 5:10. It's about living with the end in mind. Number 3, feed the good stuff. Suffice it to say, I think one of the keys to going the distance is to feed the good stuff in our lives, the things that we want to grow, things that we want to develop. And it might sound somewhat cliche, but it's so true. Whatever you feed in your life grows, and whatever you starve dies. There's a lot more I could say about that, but let's move on to the final point. Number 4, stay satisfied. You know, the ultimate defense against temptation is satisfaction, because temptation works through our lusts, according to James. And lusts are distorted expressions of God-given desires. For example, sexual desire, which is often what people think of when they hear the word lust, is God-given. Yes, God invented sex, if you didn't know. God made men and women for each other. The perpetuation of the human race depends upon it. So Yeah, it's good. It's wonderful. It's a God-given thing. But lust happens when that desire is misdirected. Then it becomes something sinful and dangerous. Proverbs 27:7 says it this way: a satisfied soul loathes the honeycomb, but to a hungry soul, every bitter thing is sweet. Perhaps you've heard the cliche that we were created with a God-shaped hole inside of us that only He can fill. Augustine said it this way: thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. But if that hunger is not satisfied with God, then even the bitter taste of sin becomes appetizing. If a person strives to be holy by desperately trying to avoid the buffet of worldly indulgences without having satisfied his soul in God, that person will remain hungry, and the temptation to sin will become greater and gain more and more power over him. But when you get full of God, sin will lose its appeal. If you become satisfied by the ultimate delight of God's presence, you will not want to waste your time with anything less. And with that, let me just say, thank you for listening. I hope these next few months are filled with fruitfulness and blessing, even in the midst of whatever trials and fire awaits us. And let me remind you one more time that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them that are called according to His purpose. That means you. Blessings.